4,000 workers, 750,000 square feet of factory floor, half a mile of railway sidings, 500 power presses stamping steel into the toys that defined British childhood, the pedal cars, the Cindy dolls, the model railways, the rocking horses that families kept for generations. Then the founders died and the decisions began. A rival acquired for its name and stripped of everything else. 41 companies scattered across 6 continents, losing money the boardroom couldn't track. A £5 million rescue that fell through in August, leaving nothing. Today, the site is a Wix, a home base, and a row of warehouse units behind a gate on Jubilee Way. No plaque marks the spot. This is the story of how 3 brothers left their father's workshop in 1919 with £28,000 and built the largest toy factory the world had ever seen, armed a nation, employed a community, put pressed steel into every child's imagination, and how the next generation lost it all in a single autumn, because the future had become plastic and was being sold on television. Chapter 1. The Smith's Grandson. The story begins in one of Victorian London's worst streets. Saffron Hill, so narrow the upper stories nearly touched, so dense with poverty that Dickens chose it as the location for Fagin's den in Oliver Twist. It was here, around 1842, that George Lines was born, the son of Abel Lines, a smith and skin dresser living at number 91. A boy raised among animal hides and forge smoke, in a neighbourhood where survival was the ambition and respectability the dream. George trained as a carpenter. By around 1860, he'd set up premises near King's Cross, making wooden toys and baby carriages, small things, hand-worked, sold to the local trade. His younger brother Joseph, born around 1848, attended St Andrew's School in Camden from the age of 7. His admission record noted he can read a little. His character assessment, written by a schoolmaster who probably never imagined it would be quoted a century and a half later, very good. Joseph left school at 13 to go to work. He gained experience in the toy trade elsewhere before joining George, and in 1876 the brothers formally established G&J Lines at the Caledonian Road Steamworks near King's Cross. They already employed 150 workers. That number bears repeating, not because the number itself is extraordinary, but because the date is 1876. 2 working-class brothers from Saffron Hill and Camden, neither of whom had received anything resembling a privileged education, were running the largest toy factory in Great Britain before Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. Their speciality was horses, rocking horses on bow rockers and later safety stands, life-size display horses for London's West End saddlers and tailors, hobby horses, toy horse and cart combinations with iron wheels. But the catalogue went further: dolls' houses, toy forts, Noah's Arks with hand-carved wooden animals, garden swings, wheelbarrows, baby carriages. Their customers included Gamages, Selfridges, Harrods, and the Army and Navy stores. For the 1887 Jubilee, they developed a new toy called the Jubilee Hobby Horse, supplied to Gamages in Holborn. The timing was shrewd. The sentiment was national. The profit margin was excellent. The business expanded the way Victorian businesses did, by absorbing everything adjacent. George and Joseph took over the North Road cattle market next door, then Carlo Gatti ice merchants, then the old stable yard of the London General Omnibus Company. They acquired a subsidiary factory in Hackney Road, Allen & Co., one of London's oldest makers of children's vehicles. In 1907, the firm became a limited company trading under the Thistle brand. By 1913, they'd outgrown Caledonian Road entirely and built the Thistle Works on a 4.5-acre site in Down Lane, Tottenham, complete with its own private railway sidings for distribution. Joseph Lines married Jane Fitzhenry on the 30th of June 1877. They had 8 children, including 4 sons: William Joseph, Walter, George Edward and Arthur Edwin. All 4 entered the family trade. But it was 3 of them, William, Walter and Arthur, who would do something their father never forgave and never recovered from. They left. Chapter 2. The Boys Who Cleaned Cows' Tails. William started at G&J Lines in 1894, aged 14. He was quiet, methodical, the sort of man who'd end up running sales. Walter, born on March 10, 1882, started 2 years later, also at 14, after attending Owen's school. His first job in the family firm was cleaning up cows' tails before they could be cured and nailed to the painted wooden rumps of rocking horses. It's a detail almost too perfectly symbolic. The future revolutionary of British toy manufacturing. On his hands and knees preparing animal parts for a product his grandfather would have recognised without a moment's confusion. Walter didn't stay on his knees long. He enrolled in evening classes, carpentry, cabinet making, design, building, and by 15 he'd invented something. A foot-propelled two-wheeler. A scooter. He tried to convince his father to put it into production. Joseph Lynes, who had built the largest toy factory in Britain on the strength of wooden horses, thought it wouldn't catch on. Walter's elders agreed. The scooter was shelved. By 1905, aged just 23, Walter was joint managing director alongside William, following the death of their uncle George. He designed the new Thistle Works in Tottenham and every toy it would make. Arthur, the youngest brother, joined around 1910, also at 14. 3 brothers, all trained from adolescence in every aspect of the trade, all increasingly restless with the pace of their father's workshop. Then came the war. Walter served as a captain in the Royal Horse Artillery in Italy and France, receiving a mention in dispatches. Arthur and George Edward also served. William, older, remained at the factory. When the 3 younger brothers returned from the trenches, they were not the same men who had left. They'd seen mechanisation on an industrial scale. They'd watched tanks make horses obsolete on the battlefield. And they drew a parallel that their father could not. If horses were finished in warfare, they were finished in the toy trade too. The future wasn't hand-carved wood. It was pressed steel, mass production, modern manufacturing methods. Everything Joseph Lynes had spent his life perfecting was about to become the past. They tried to convince him. Joseph, now in his 70s, was having none of it. He was, as one account puts it, reluctant to depart from the old ways which had served him very well. A showdown followed. The sources are discreet about the details, but the outcome was unambiguous. The 3 brothers found it impossible to change their father's mind. So they made a decision that was either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily ruthless, depending on which side of the workshop door you stood on. They walked out. And they set up in direct competition with their own father. Lynes Brothers Limited was registered on May 1st, 1919. Walter was 37. Arthur was 23. William was approaching 40. They had skills, ambition and a plan. What they didn't have was money. Chapter 3. £28,000. The brothers were not entirely alone. Their initial board included 3 crucial allies. R.C. Munro, owner of an established engineering company, George Campbell, a brother-in-law, and, most remarkably, Sir Ralph Freeman, another brother-in-law, a civil engineer who would later design the Sydney Harbour Bridge. These were not toy makers. They were engineers. Their presence on the board told you everything about what the brothers intended. This would be an engineering company that happened to make toys. They borrowed £28,000 from Lloyd's Bank. In June 1919, they bought the Hatcham Works in Ormside Street, off the Old Kent Road. 45,000 square feet of factory space plus a timber wharf on the Surrey Canal. They sold off the old equipment, refitted the place with modern machinery, and Walter designed the first range of toys, sold under the brand name Triang, a portmanteau suggesting Triang toys, itself derived from a triangle formed by 3 lines. 3 brothers, 3 lines, a triangle. It was clever, it was memorable, and it carried the family story in its geometry. The timing could not have been better. Before 1914, the German toy industry had dominated the world market, particularly in metal toys, where the factories of Nuremberg and Fürth were unchallenged. The war destroyed that dominance. German imports were banned. Anti-German sentiment was fierce. Trade journals sneered at what they called the appalling dolls at Sonneberg, whose ugliness frightened the little children of England and France. A movement for British toys for British boys was sweeping the industry. Lynes Brothers stepped into a vacuum. Their first showing at the British Industries Fair in February 1920 produced approximately £40,000 in orders. The company was barely a year old. They opened 20 to 30 new accounts every month throughout 1920. Net profits in the first year approached £8,000. Harvey Greenacre and Company of Durban, South Africa, became an early customer. So did Harrods. Walter's factory design, roughly 30 separate departments enabling extreme division of labour, gave them a devastating efficiency advantage over every competitor, including the one they knew best. A telling comparison makes the point with uncomfortable precision. Each Lynes Bros employee produced 625 dolls prams in 1923. At G&J Lynes, their own father's company, the figure was 181 per employee. The sons hadn't just left. They'd made the old firm look slow. Joseph Lynes died on 31st December 1931. G&J Lynes had no viable leadership without him. In 1932, Lynes Brothers acquired its trade names and trademarks. The family succession was complete, but not in the way anyone in Joseph's generation would have imagined. The sons hadn't inherited their father's business. They'd beaten it, bought it, and absorbed it. It was, perhaps, the first sign that this was a family whose ambition would always outrun its sentiment. Chapter 4. The Triangle on Morden Road. By 1923, the old Kent Road premises were bursting. The brothers needed space, not just for a factory, but for the kind of factory Walter Lynes had been designing in his head since the trenches. In December 1923, they placed a contract for a new works on Morden Road, Merton, South London, on a site of approximately 27 acres. The choice was strategic. The River Wandle corridor through South London was rich in industrial heritage: mills, calico printing works, William Morris's famous printing operation from 1881. The area had good rail connections, the land was affordable, and it was large enough for Walter's grand vision, not merely a factory, but a self-contained industrial city. Within 18 months, the move was complete. The new Triang works opened with approximately 500 employees and 191,000 square feet of floor space. The formal registration of the Triang Toys trademark came around 1924. 3 lines make a triangle. Easy to say, easy to remember, impossible to forget. The spelling would shift over the decades: Triang, 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 but the identity never wavered. Then the building began in earnest. Another 110,000 square feet added by 1928. A further 164,000 square feet between 1929 and 1935. By 1950, the complex covered 750,000 square feet. Walter designed nearly every inch of it. The interwar years were when Lynes Brothers transformed from a successful toy company into something without precedent. Walter drove the business with what one historian called megalomania for buying out rivals. He didn't just buy competing toy makers, he bought paint companies, Merton, because they used enormous quantities of paint. Paper companies, for packaging. Forestry, to grow their own timber. This was vertical integration pursued to its logical extreme. Control every material, every process, every stage, from raw timber to wrapped Christmas present. The product range expanded in every direction. By 1929, the catalogue listed pedigree prams, fairy cycles, motor cars, pedal cars, folding baby carriages, engines, barrows, scooters, dolls' prams, dolls' houses, desks, juvenile furniture, and swings. The pressed steel pedal cars became the emotional signature of the brand. Heavy, beautifully finished machines aimed at middle-class children whose parents were buying real motor cars for the first time. Over 200 different pressed steel vehicle types would eventually be produced. From red-bonneted tipper lorries and shell tankers to London Transport double-decker buses and military vehicles. Every small boy of the 1920s and 30s yearned for one. Many never stopped yearning. In 1931, 3 acquisitions signalled how far the ambition now reached. Lynes Brothers bought Hamley's, the famous Regent Street toy shop, which was struggling after overspending on its premises. They registered Pedigree as a subsidiary doll-making brand. and they acquired a considerable interest in International Model Aircraft Limited, a joint enterprise with Charles Bill Wilmot, John Wilmot, and Joe Mansour, an aircraft modeller who would later design military gliders during the war. IMA launched the first Frog model in 1932, the Interceptor Mark IV, a semi-scale rubber band-powered flying aircraft. The name stood for Flies Right Off the Ground. In 1936, they produced something genuinely revolutionary: the Frog Penguin range, the world's first injection-moulded plastic model aircraft kits at 1:72 scale. The sub-brand was called Penguin with Knowing Wit, a bird that doesn't fly, for model aircraft that didn't fly. In France, the Frog brand was deemed too offensive, being a slur for French people, so kits were sold as Triang. In North America, the name was changed to Airlines, a pun on Lines Brothers. In 1933, Lines Brothers became a public company with an issue of 200,000 preference shares. In January 1935, the Minic range launched, 14 clockwork tinplate vehicles at approximately 1:43 scale, filling the gap between expensive large models and small dinky toys. Minic vehicles would eventually number over 70 models. By 1932, the Merton works employed approximately 2,000 people. An observer described the site: imposing exterior, commissionaire on the gates, a wide carriage drive leading to general offices, numerous canteens, a first aid station, tennis courts, a cricket pitch, and 2 full-size football pitches. The football field sat in the centre of the complex, doubling as a testing ground where IMA engineers launched their model aircraft across the grass. Then war came, and the factory that made children's pedal cars was asked to make something else entirely. Walter Lines offered to take on a bigger challenge than anyone expected. As a specialist in pressed sheet steel, the same material used for toy lorries and pedal cars, he proposed redesigning the Sten submachine gun to suit his factory's machinery. He'd never designed a gun in his life. He reduced the parts count from 69 in the Mark II to just 48 in the Mark III, made it lighter, and cut manufacturing time to 5.5 hours per weapon. The War Office approved the design and ordered 500,000. Production began in spring 1942. 3 shifts ran the factory 24 hours a day. By the time production ceased in autumn 1943, the Merton toy factory had manufactured 876,886 Sten Mark III submachine guns, making Lines Brothers the largest producer of the type. These weapons were used by the Home Guard and parachute dropped to partisan fighters across occupied Europe. The Germans gave captured examples a formal designation: MP750E. The Sten guns weren't all. With approximately 7,000 workers now on site, the factory also produced 14 million magazines for Hurricane and Spitfire aircraft, shell cases, landmine cases, gliders, 4 types, some powered by solid fuel rockets designed by Joe Mansour, infrared night vision apparatus, and scale models of the Normandy beaches used in preparation for D-Day. On June 10, 1941, King George VI visited to inspect munitions production. The Duchess of Kent followed on 28 May 1943. Women workers played critical roles, particularly in welding and final hand assembly of the Sten guns. From early 1941, women aged 18 to 60 were required to register for war work. The factory was partially bombed in 1940, but production continued. As Walter Lines' son Graham later observed with characteristic understatement, the man who redesigned one of the most widely produced weapons of the Second World War had never designed a gun in his life. It was the most extraordinary demonstration of what Lines Bros actually was. Not a toy company, not a weapons company. A company whose core competence was the industrial mastery of pressed steel at scale. They could make anything: pedal cars, submachine guns, model railways, dolls' houses, because they understood the material, the machinery, and the mathematics of mass production. The product was almost incidental. The capability was everything. And when the war ended, they turned that capability loose on the biggest generation of children the country had ever produced. Chapter 5. 750,000 square feet. The post-war baby boom hit Britain like a weather system, predictable in theory, overwhelming in practice. Millions of new children needed millions of new toys, and the Merton factory was ready for them in a way no competitor could match. Conversion from wartime production was remarkably swift. The presses that had stamped Sten gun receivers were retooled for pedal car body panels. The assembly lines that had armed partisans began making dolls' prams. And the workforce, trained to military precision, accustomed to 3-shift patterns and relentless output, simply changed what they were making. New factories opened fast. Merthyr Tydfil in Wales, 1945. Belfast, the Pedigree Works, officially opened on 16th of October 1946 by Countess Granville, focused on soft toys. The company acquired W. Pierce Limited in Levant to secure timber supplies. Joy Toys Limited in New Zealand gave them Commonwealth manufacturing. A Canadian subsidiary was founded in 1947 using the old Thistle trademark from Joseph Lyons' era, with its main factory at 4000 St Patrick Street, Montreal. In 1951, they took a 50% stake in Cyclops Pty Ltd in Australia, acquiring the rest 4 years later. By 1954, Lyons Brothers South Africa had factories in Durban and Mokani with showrooms across southern Africa. At the 1947 British Industries Fair, Lyons Brothers made a claim that would have sounded absurd 2 decades earlier. World's largest toy and pram manufacturers. It was almost certainly true. By 1950, the Merton factory had reached its peak physical form. A contemporary article in Games and Toys magazine painted a picture of industrial scale that reads, "Even now, like the specifications of a small city. 750,000 square feet of factory floor. Over 4,000 employees arriving and leaving in shift patterns that set the rhythm of every surrounding street. One of the largest tool rooms in London, containing more than 200 expert tool makers, making and maintaining tools and dies for over 500 power presses, machines delivering up to 300 tons of pressure, and 1,000 hand presses. An in-house paint laboratory producing 2,000 gallons of paint every week, with additional quantities purchased from outside suppliers. A 1¼ acre sawmill where the company felled its own timber, converted it, dried it in kilns, and did its own turnery. 1/2 mile of railway sidings connecting the factory to the national rail network. Every packing case, every crate, every cardboard box, made on site. The energy system was a marvel of engineering that wasted nothing. All sawdust and wood cuttings from the sawmill were exhausted directly from machines to gas producers. The gas-heated boilers, whose steam first drove high-speed engines powering air compressors, then the exhaust steam-heated production plant, plating tanks, conveyor drying ovens, and finally heated the premises and supplied hot water. Walter Lyons had designed a factory that fed on its own waste. Follow a sheet of steel from the railway siding to the loading bay, and you'd trace the entire logic of the place. Raw materials arrived along the north side, steel sheets, timber, rubber, paint components, carried in on those 1/2 mile sidings that connected Merton to the national network. Steel went to the press shops where banks of power presses stamped, bent, and formed it into toy bodies, chassis, wheel arches, bonnets. The noise in the press shop was the heartbeat of the whole complex, rhythmic, percussive, relentless. You didn't just hear those presses, you felt them through the soles of your shoes. Timber went to the sawmill for cutting and shaping, the smell of fresh sawn wood mixing with lacquer fumes and the sharper tang of solder from the metal workbenches. Paint went to the laboratory for mixing, and from the laboratory to the spray booths and the conveyor drying ovens, where toy after toy after toy moved through controlled heat on an endless belt. The chrome plating tanks gave pedal cars their gleaming bumpers and radiator grills. The same plating process, the same chemical bite in the air that you'd find in any motorcar factory in Coventry or Dagenham. Assembly lines brought everything together. Metal workers, painters, assemblers, finishers, working across approximately 30 separate departments, each one specialising in a stage of production. Finished toys were packaged in crates made on site and dispatched back out through the same railway sidings they'd arrived by as raw materials. Walter Lines had designed this departmental structure deliberately. Each worker specialised in a specific task. It was brilliant for efficiency, and it meant that many roles were semi-skilled, keeping wage costs low while output climbed. The Merton works was Fordist mass production applied to the making of playthings. Henry Ford built motorcars this way. Walter Lines built rocking horses, pedal cars, and dolls' prams. The principle was identical. The product was smaller. Chapter 6. The streets that walked to work. The workforce of over 4,000 was drawn overwhelmingly from the surrounding streets of Merton, Morden, and South Wimbledon. The High Path estate sat adjacent to the factory. Workers walked or cycled in from the terraced houses of Wandle Road, Nelson Grove Road, and Meadow Road. The factory didn't just employ the neighbourhood, it organised it. Its shift patterns set the rhythm of local life. Its canteens provided meals. Its football pitches and cricket ground provided recreation. Its demand for labour, steady, reliable, year after year, shaped the community into something that existed in large part because the factory did. The 200 toolmakers were the aristocrats of the shop floor, highly skilled engineers maintaining and creating the dies and moulds that made mass production possible. Below them, in the hierarchy, but no less essential, press operators running the heavy machinery, woodworkers staffing the sawmill, painters working with those thousands of gallons of paint and lacquer that gave Triang toys their characteristic bright, hard-wearing finishes. Assemblers, many of them women, brought the pieces together. Injection moulders operated the increasingly important plastics machinery. Platers worked the chrome plating tanks. Each skill had its own status, its own rate, its own sense of professional identity. Women were central to the operation and always had been. They'd welded and assembled Sten guns during the war. In peacetime, they dominated the doll-making departments. International Model Aircraft Limited, the subsidiary based on the Merton site, was described as the only factory in the world which could produce complete dolls, including their wigs, shoes, dresses, voices, paint dyes, and moving eyes, entirely under one roof. The doll production lines employed sculptors like Dennis Arkinstall, who worked in research and development and was influential in designing the Cindy doll, and Eric Griffiths, who sculpted the face of the Patch doll. These weren't anonymous assembly line workers. They were skilled craftspeople whose hands shaped products that millions of children would hold. Ian Veacock, a resident of the High Path estate, who documented the area's heritage, recalled the concentration of manufacturing packed into this corner of South London. Triang at Merton, the largest toy manufacturing site in the world. New Merton Board Mills, the largest UK producer of cardboard packing cases, right next door. Fry's Die Casting and Ire Smelting, the largest producers of non-ferrous metals in the country. Then Ruthertherm, Caulfield and Buckle, Pie Records along Station Road, Payne's Fireworks, Pascal's Boiled Sweets, Renshaw's Marzipan, Foster Transformers, Bradbury Wilson Security Printers, Carter's Seeds, and Littler producing fabrics for Liberties of London. This was a landscape of making things. Fireworks and marzipan, security printing and transformer coils, boiled sweets and gramophone records, all within walking distance of one another, all feeding families from the same terraced streets. And at the centre of it all, the biggest maker of them all, the factory with the triangle on the gate. The toys that left those gates embodied a philosophy that now seems almost alien. Toys should be heavy, solid, and made to last. The pressed steel pedal cars were the supreme expression of this belief. Fashioned from the same techniques used to manufacture real car body panels, stamped, formed, welded, painted, and chrome detailed, they weighed enough that a child could barely lift one. Models included Grand Prix racers, Jeeps with Willys MB front grills, convertibles, roadsters. A remarkable prototype Triang Amphicar, serial number 00001, produced in 1966 or 67, featured working lights, navigation lights, and propellers that turned when pedalled. It never reached production. The prototype escaped the factory as a retirement gift to a research and development worker, one of the few artefacts to survive the demolition that would follow. When people are asked what they remember about Triang, the answer centres on those pedal cars and tricycles. Perhaps a doll's house. Perhaps a rocking horse in the nursery. These were the physical anchors of British childhood, passed down through families, battered but indestructible. The quality wasn't a marketing slogan. It was a material fact rooted in pressed steel engineering. You could stand on a Triang pedal car. Many children did, often to their parents' dismay, and the car held. Chapter 7. 41 companies, 6 continents. The acquisition that turned Lines Brothers from Britain's biggest toy maker into a genuine industrial conglomerate came in October 1951, when they purchased Rovex Plastics Limited, a small Richmond-based company founded in 1946 by Alexander Gregory Venetian. Venetian had pulled off something remarkable the previous Christmas. He'd produced an electric train set, a Princess Elizabeth locomotive, for Marks and Spencer at the revolutionary price of £2, 17 shillings and sixpence. Roughly half the price of anything comparable. The trains were made from cellulose acetate plastic. They were crude but astonishing value. Rovex lacked the capital to grow. Lines Bros swooped in. The company was renamed Rovex Scale Models Limited, and in 1952 its trains were launched as Triang Railways at the British Industries Trade Fair. The range used 00 gauge at 1/76 scale on 2-rail track powered by 12-volt DC, a key innovation over competitors' 3-rail systems. By the early 1960s, the catalogue listed 11 train sets and 110 models, including 27 different locomotives. In 1954, Rovex moved to a purpose-built factory in Margate, Kent, the same site where Hornby operates to this day. Richard Lines, Arthur's son, was largely responsible for the Triang Railways system. There is a delightful footnote to the early Rovex story. The cellulose acetate shrank over time, meaning all surviving examples from that era are, as collectors note, somewhat banana-shaped. In 1958, Lines Brothers acquired Mini Models Limited, makers of Scalextric, electric slot car racing invented by Fred Francis using clockwork metal cars in 1952, electrified in 1957. With Lines Bros manufacturing muscle, the metal cars were converted to plastic, and the range massively expanded. Scalextric would become one of the most enduring toy brands of the 20th century. Then came Cindy. Launched on 6 September 1963, this was Pedigree's answer to Barbie, and the story of her creation reveals Lines Bros at its cultural sharpest. The company had been offered a license to produce Barbie for the British market and turned it down. Market research showed British girls didn't like the full-busted sugar and spice Barbie. So they developed their own doll, borrowing elements from the American doll Tammy with Ideal Toy Company's permission. The name was chosen via a street poll of young girls. Cindy was the favourite, but it couldn't be trademarked, so Richard Lines changed the C to an S. The launch was innovative by any standard. Promotional gramophone records sent to London retailers. Green Ford Anglia vans driven by Pedigree salesmen. And, crucially, a 30-second television commercial, making Cindy the first UK toy ever advertised on television. The trade response was cool. Consumer demand was immediate and overwhelming. By the end of 1963, IMA worked all possible shifts to produce 40,000 dolls. Cindy became the best-selling toy in Britain in 1968 and again in 1970, accounting for 80% of Pedigree's sales. The crown jewel came in February 1964. Lines Bros purchased Meccano Lutted, the most famous name in British toy history, for approximately £781,000. The deal included the factory at Binns Road, Liverpool, the French Meccano factories, the Hornby Railway range, Dinky Toys, and the Bayco construction brand. The last members of the Hornby family were removed from office. The Hornby name was grafted onto Triang's plastic trains, creating Triang Hornby from 1965. By 1966, Lines Brothers comprised 41 companies worldwide, with agents in 63 countries, showrooms across the UK, Europe, North America, Africa and Australasia, and 10 factories outside Britain. The company owned Hamleys on Regent Street and approximately 60 specialist toy shops, trading as Youngsters Limited. Pedal cars, model railways, slot car racing, dolls, construction sets, die-cast vehicles, rocking horses, dolls' houses, prams, bicycles, model aircraft, scooters, educational toys. No toy company in history had ever been so large. It had taken three brothers 45 years to build an empire from a £28,000 bank loan. It would take their sons less than a decade to lose it all. Chapter 8. The Year. Everything looked invincible. If you had to choose a single year for the summit, it would be 1964. Meccano consumed. Cindy conquering nurseries across the country. Triang Hornby in preparation. The company had just swallowed its greatest rival. It bestrode the British toy trade like a colossus. And at that exact moment, in the same year, in a country whose television culture Linesbros had barely begun to understand, Hasbro launched G.I. Joe. The world's first action figure accounted for 2/3 of Hasbro's total sales within 12 months. Mattel, already 5 years into the Barbie phenomenon, was building a marketing machine powered by television advertising at a scale no British company could begin to match. Mattel had been spending $500,000 a year on TV advertising since 1955, when it took the revolutionary step of sponsoring the Mickey Mouse Club on ABC, the first year-round toy advertising on American television. In Hong Kong and Japan, factories were tooling up to flood Western markets with cheap plastic toys at prices no British manufacturer could touch. W. Graham Lines, who became joint managing director in 1962, later gave an interview of startling candour about the Meccano acquisition. He'd spent the previous 10 years as marketing director, he said, running Hornby into the ground. And then we acquired Meccano, and they made me chairman of Meccano. He laughed. So I said to myself, am I going to spend a lot more time trying to resuscitate it? He decided it was ridiculous. The one thing about Hornby that was internationally known and respected was the name, so they transferred it to Triang Railways. The modern Hornby brand, he said, has no relationship at all to the Hornby product originally. It's entirely Triang Railways, but it's called Hornby. This is the voice of a man describing how one of the most famous brands in British toy history was hollowed out, its products discarded, its name stapled onto a competitor's range, and finding it amusing. It is the sound of an empire that has lost the ability to hear what it is saying. The Merton factory was still running at full capacity. 4,000 workers still walked through the gates. The pressed steel still sang under the power presses. But the ground beneath all of it had already begun to shift, and the men now running the company were looking at the wrong horizon. Chapter 9. The world that changed around them. The forces that would destroy Linesbros were not hidden. They were not subtle. They were visible to anyone in the toy trade who cared to look across the Atlantic, which was precisely the problem. The men running Lines Brothers were looking at trade fairs, at toy shop buyers, at catalogue spreads. The Americans were looking at something else entirely. They were looking at television screens. Hasbro's Mr. Potato Head, advertised directly to children on American television in 1952, was the first toy marketed this way. It was a novelty then, an experiment. 3 years later, Mattel turned the experiment into a revolution. In 1955, they took the extraordinary gamble of sponsoring the Mickey Mouse Club on ABC, committing $500,000 a year to become the first toy company to advertise on television year-round, not just at Christmas. The bet paid off beyond anything the industry had seen. For the first time, a toy company could generate demand among children before their parents ever walked into a shop. The child arrived at the counter already wanting the product. The shopkeeper's recommendation, the entire basis of the British toy trade's sales model, became irrelevant. By the early 1960s, Mattel and Hasbro had built entire business models around television-driven demand creation. Mattel's characters Matty Mattel and Belle hosted their own shows. Hasbro's G.I. Joe, launched in 1964, generated 2/3 of the company's total sales within a year. Not because it sat well on a shelf, but because every American boy had seen it move and fight and parachute on a screen in his living room. Linesbros wasn't entirely blind to television. Cindy's 1963 launch included that pioneering 30-second commercial on ITV, the first UK toy ever advertised on television. But Cindy was the exception. The rest of the product range, the pedal cars, the minic vehicles, the construction sets, the model railways, was still being sold the old way, through trade shows, through print advertising, through relationships with buyers at Hamleys and Gamages, and the independent toy shops that lined every British high street. Lines Bros was selling to shopkeepers. The Americans were selling to children. It was a difference that looked like a detail and turned out to be everything. The shift from metal to plastic was the second transformation. Plastics had become widely available after the war, and by the 1960s the transition was accelerating. Lines Bros understood plastic. The Rovex acquisition in 1951 proved that, and Triang Railways was an excellent plastic product. But the heart of the business, the identity of the company, remained in pressed steel. The pedal cars, the minic vehicles, the Meccano sets, the dinky toys, the spot-on die-cast range produced at the Castlereagh factory in Belfast, where Murray Lines himself had personally selected a model range that was, as he saw it, uniquely British. These were heavy, expensive, beautifully made products sold through traditional toy shops at decent margins. They were being replaced by cheap, mass-produced plastic alternatives that could be sold anywhere, in the new supermarkets, in the variety stores, in the chain shops that were quietly reshaping British retail while Lines Bros kept its eyes on the specialist trade. From the 1960s onwards, factories in Hong Kong and Japan compounded the problem. Labour costs in Southeast Asia were a fraction of British levels. The products were inferior, everyone in the trade knew that, but they were adequate, and they were fantastically cheap. The penny toy end of the market, the impulse purchases, the pocket money range, all of it was draining away to Asia. Lines Bros couldn't compete on price. Its entire manufacturing philosophy was built on quality and weight. Quality and weight were becoming liabilities. Then came Hot Wheels. Mattel launched them in 1968, cheap, flashy, plastic and die-cast hybrids with low-friction axles that made them faster and more exciting than anything in a child's existing collection. They were marketed on American television with a ferocity that dinky toys had never faced. Hot Wheels didn't just compete with traditional die-cast vehicles, they made them look old. Dinky Toys and Spot On, both now sheltering under the Lines Bros umbrella, were suddenly fighting for survival against a product that cost less, looked better to children raised on television, and was backed by a marketing budget that dwarfed anything a British company could afford. The broader British economy offered no shelter. The 1967 devaluation of sterling, from $2.80 to $2.40 per pound, reflected a malaise that ran deeper than exchange rates. The corporate profit share of national income fell from 24% in early 1960 to just over 18% by late 1967. The rate of return on capital across British industry dropped from nearly 29% to under 20%, by rising labour costs, declining competitiveness, persistent trade. Deficits. Lines Bros was fighting a revolution in the global toy industry while standing on ground that was sinking beneath every British manufacturer's feet. Chapter 10. The year the founders vanished. The external forces were formidable, but what made them fatal was what happened inside the walls, and that began with a single devastating year. In 1962, all three founding brothers departed simultaneously. Arthur Lines died. William Lines died. Walter Lines, now 80 years old, retired as chairman and became life president. 2 deaths and 1 retirement in the same 12-month period. The entire founding generation, with all its accumulated knowledge, all its instinct, all its authority, vanished from the boardroom in the time it takes the Earth to go round the sun. The second generation stepped up. W. Moray Lines, Walter's son, became chairman. W. Graham Lines became joint managing director. Richard Lines, Arthur's son, continued his work on the railways division. These were men who had grown up in the business, who understood it from the inside, who carried the family name. But they were not their fathers. Professor Kenneth D. Brown of Queen's University Belfast, the leading academic authority on British toy industry history, framed the collapse explicitly as a family business failure. His 2005 paper carried a title that read like a death certificate: Family Failure, Lines Brothers Limited, Deceased, 1971. His diagnosis was precise: the passing of generations and the loss of drive and tenacity. Walter Lines had dominated the company for over 40 years. He'd designed the factory, he'd designed the toys, he'd redesigned the Sten gun. He was the visionary, the deal maker, the man whose name opened doors and whose instincts closed deals. His departure created a vacuum that couldn't be filled by committee, and a committee was what replaced him. The management of 41 subsidiaries worldwide, with their overlapping brands, competing product lines, and diverse markets, demanded professional corporate governance of a kind the family culture had never developed. The branding alone was, as one analyst described it, slightly haphazard. A single product might carry 4 different brand names, depending on market and territory. International operations in the United States and Europe were underperforming. The American subsidiary was struggling in a market dominated by Mattel and Hasbro, companies that understood their own country's television culture in ways a family from Merton never could. The complexity of the empire had outgrown the capacity of the people running it. And then, 2 years after inheriting this empire at the worst possible moment, the second generation made the decision that would accelerate everything. They bought Meccano. The acquisition in February 1964 looked like consolidation. Lines Bros was eliminating its biggest British competitor, acquiring 3 of the most prestigious names in the toy trade, Meccano, Hornby, Dinky, and confirming its dominance. The price was approximately £781,000. For that money, they received the factory at Binns Road in Liverpool, the French Meccano factories, and a collection of product lines whose problems were already visible to anyone who cared to look. The Binns Road factory was 60 years old, with all the inefficiencies that implied. Meccano's core product, metal construction sets with nuts, bolts and spanners, was in structural decline. Lego had entered the British market on 25th of January 1960, and its colourful plastic bricks were growing rapidly. By 1965, Lego held a significant share of the European construction toy market. Meccano looked like a toy from another century, which, in a sense, it was. The Liverpool workforce, accustomed to different methods, proved difficult to integrate. And when Lines Bros changed Meccano's colour scheme to yellow and black, they managed to alienate the traditional enthusiasts without attracting new customers. They'd paid £750,000 for the privilege of inheriting someone else's terminal illness and adding it to their own symptoms. The Meccano acquisition also forced a painful choice between 2 competing die-cast brands. Lines Bros' own Spot On range, produced at the Castlereagh factory in Belfast, and the far more established Dinky toys that came with Meccano. They kept Dinky and killed Spot On in 1967. It was the rational decision. But it was a company rationalising its way out of problems it had created through over-acquisition in the first place, cutting away parts of itself to treat a disease whose cause was the habit of acquiring too much. There is a poignant symbolism in what Walter Lines did after retiring. He established Goodwood Playthings Limited in Levant, near Chichester, making handmade wooden toys. The man who had revolutionised the British toy industry by moving from wood to pressed steel spent his final years going back to wood, as if the instincts of Joseph Lines's workshop, the rocking horses, the hand-carved animals, the cows' tails, had never really left him. Chapter 11. The Spreadsheet and the Screen. The company was now caught in a trap of its own construction. 41 subsidiaries across 6 continents. 10 factories outside Britain. In Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. 60 specialist toy shops trading as Youngsters Limited. Hamleys on Regent Street. Agents in 63 countries. The overhead was enormous. The losses were mounting. And the men running it all were a family from South London who had never managed anything on this scale. Because nobody in the toy industry ever had. The international operations became the primary hemorrhage. Each overseas subsidiary had been established to circumvent import restrictions and capture local markets. A sound strategy on paper, a management nightmare in practice. The American operation was losing money in a market where Mattel and Hasbro played by rules Lines Bros hadn't learned. European ventures faced saturation. Each subsidiary added complexity, overhead, and risk. The revenues weren't covering the costs. The empire that Walter Lines had assembled as a demonstration of global reach was becoming a demonstration of global exposure. Meanwhile, the revolution Lines Bros had failed to join was accelerating. Mattel's television advertising budget continued to grow. Hasbro was building brands that existed primarily as television concepts. The toy was almost secondary to the screen presence. The British toy trade was still organised around the Toy Fair at Harrogate and the Brighton Toy Fair, where manufacturers showed their ranges to buyers who then decided what to stock. The American model had bypassed the buyer entirely. The child demanded, the parent complied, the retailer stocked what was demanded. Lines Bros still had the most comprehensive range in the British market. Comprehensiveness no longer mattered when a single television advertised product could outsell an entire catalogue of unadvertised ones. The financial position deteriorated through the late 1960s. By 1970, Lines Bros posted a catastrophic loss of £4.5 million. Debts were spiralling. International operations were consuming cash the domestic business couldn't generate. The pedal cars still rolled off the Merton presses. The Cindy dolls still sold. The Triang Hornby trains still ran on their two-rail track in attics and spare rooms across Britain. But the structure above them, the 41-company, six-continent empire, was collapsing under its own weight. The board pinned its last hope on a rescue. Gallagher, the tobacco giant, was looking to diversify out of an industry facing its own existential threats. A deal worth £5 million was negotiated. Lines Bros would receive the capital injection it desperately needed. Gallagher would acquire a portfolio of famous brands and a global distribution network. It was a classic late 1960s strategy, a cash-rich conglomerate buying a struggling manufacturer. The logic was sound from both sides. The board appears to have delayed taking radical action, closing subsidiaries, selling assets, cutting the empire down to a survivable core, while waiting for Gallagher's money to arrive. The rescue was the plan. There was no plan B. In August 1971, Gallagher withdrew. Chapter 12. The Autumn of 41. Companies no reserves, no fallback, no time. Lines Bros called in the official receiver in the autumn of 1971. The company that had been the largest toy manufacturer in the world, the company that had made 876,886 submachine guns for a nation at war, that had put a pedal car in every child's imagination, that had claimed 6 continents and 41 subsidiaries and a factory floor of 750,000 square feet, was broke. The accumulated debts stood at approximately £17.5 million. The loss the previous year had been £4.5 million. The Merton factory, which had employed over 4,000 people at its peacetime peak and 7,000 during the war, was among the assets to be broken up and sold. The human cost, the number of workers made redundant at Merton specifically, the families affected, the community response, is frustratingly, characteristically, poorly documented. This was a working-class South London workforce, and working-class voices are the first to be lost from the historical record. No parliamentary debate about the Lines Bros collapse has been found in Hansard. No detailed trade union response survives in the publicly available record. What survives is a video, shot around 1972, showing workers leaving the former Triang factory in Morden Road. It is brief. It is silent. Ordinary people walking out of an extraordinary place that would soon be rubble. The receiver's task was to dismantle an empire. It was done with the methodical efficiency of an auctioneer clearing a house. Triang pedigree, the Merton factory, plus the Birmingham and Merthyr Tydfil works, was sold to Barclays Securities for £3,600,000, plus a further £1,678,000 for the freehold of the factories. It became part of the Barclay Toy Group, alongside Sable, Chad Valley, Chiltern and Chas. Methven. The adult cycle business went to Raleigh. £800,000. The Australian and New Zealand operations, Cyclops Triang, 10 companies, went to Tube Investments for $2.25 million. Rovex Triang Limited, the model railway and hobby division including the Margate and Canterbury factories, was renamed Pocket Money Toys Limited, then sold as Rovex Limited to Dunby Convex Marks. The Triang brand name was sold separately to Barclay Securities. DCM, denied the Triang name, was forced to rebrand. From 1 January 1972, Triang Railways became Hornby Railways, the name it carries to this day. The name that, as Graham Lyons had said with that unnerving laugh, has no relationship at all to the Hornby product originally. Meccano Triang Limited passed through a temporary holding company called Malfords Limited and was eventually sold to Airfix. The French Meccano operations went to General Mills of the United States. G&R Wren bought itself free as Wren Railways and continued producing former Hornby Dublo models for over 26 years. The teddy bear range was taken over by Canterbury Bears. The wooden toy business went to Walter Lyons' Goodwood Playthings, a quiet coda, the old man's retirement project receiving a fragment of the empire he'd built. Jim Mulholland, the pedigree soft toys production manager in Belfast, set up his own factory called Mulholland & Bailey, one of the few examples of a Lyons Bros worker building something from the wreckage rather than simply walking away from it. Walter Lyons was 90 years old when the company fell. He was in Levant, making handmade wooden toys. He died on November the 23rd, 1972, 13 months after Lyons Bros was declared insolvent. His daughter Peggy continued to manage Goodwood Playthings. Even the rescuers didn't survive long. Dunby Convex Marks collapsed and filed for bankruptcy in 1980. Hornby Railways endured 2 successive corporate collapses before a management buyout saved it in 1981. Triang Pedigree, under Barclay Securities, received a government-backed rescue involving Airfix in 1975, only to be put in the receiver's hands again in 1977. The Merthyr Tydfil factory closed in 1978. It was as if the poison in Lyons Bros' bloodstream spread to every company that touched its remains. Chapter 13. Jubilee Way. The entire Merton factory was demolished in 1974, 3 years from receivership to rubble. Every building, every press, every conveyor belt, every railway siding. The half-mile of track along the north side of the complex was ripped out. Decades later, in 1989, the road Merton Way was built on its alignment. You can drive over the ghost of those sidings now without knowing they were ever there. Today the site is Merton Industrial Park, accessed via Jubilee Way off the A24. The occupants include a home base, a Wix, White Light Limited, a professional lighting hire company, and a series of steel frame warehouse units with brick cladding, pitched roofs and electric roller shutter loading doors. Unit 15 offers 6,831 square feet. Unit 20A is a secure fenced and gated open yard of 22,076 square feet, available for rent. A big yellow storage facility sits on the southern boundary. There is no plaque. The English Heritage Blue Plaque scheme requires a surviving building closely associated with the subject. Since the factory was completely demolished, it is ineligible. The entire London Borough of Merton has 11 English Heritage Blue Plaques. None relates to Lyons Brothers. The Merton Working Heritage Project and the Merton Historical Society have documented the factory's history in their publications. The Wandle Industrial Museum in Mitcham collaborates on local heritage work. But there is nothing physical on the ground, not a sign, not a marker, not a stone to tell you what stood here. The terraced houses where workers once lived have largely been replaced by council flats on the High Path estate, which is itself now undergoing major regeneration. The landscape of making things that Ian Veacock remembered, the fireworks and marzipan, the boiled sweets and gramophone records, the non-ferrous metals and cardboard packing cases, has gone the way of the toy factory. South Wimbledon Underground Station is a 10-minute walk. The Morden Road tramlink stop is closer. The sounds of traffic on the A24 and the rumble of delivery vehicles. The air smells of nothing in particular. The brands, remarkably, outlived the company that made them, transplanted, hollowed out, passed through multiple corporate collapses, but still breathing. Hornby remains a publicly traded company based in Margate, owning Hornby, Scalextric, Airfix and Corgi. Many of the original Triang toolings and designs are still in use. Cindy has been relaunched repeatedly. Hasbro acquired the rights in 1986, returned them to Pedigree in 1998, and the doll has been revived by various manufacturers since, including a 60th anniversary edition in 2023. Cindy has now outlived the company, the factory, and every person who designed her. Meccano passed through Airfix, then various international owners, and continues in production. Scalextric thrives. The collector's market keeps the physical objects in circulation. The Triang Society, founded over 2 decades ago, has more than 650 members and produces a regular professionally printed magazine. Richard Lynes, Arthur's son, was a supporter of the society until his death on 28 January 2020, the last surviving member of the Lynes family who had worked within the toy empire. The Hornby Railway Collectors Association, founded in 1969, has nearly 3,000 members. Spot-on die-cast models command high prices at auction. Original frog kits from the 1950s are sought after. Pre-1971 Cindy dolls carry a premium. The primary archival record, 505 files of company records, photographs, catalogues and papers, resides at the Young V&A at Bethnal Green, donated in part by W. Graham Lynes himself. It is the boardroom's record. The shop floor's record is thinner. The workers' stories were never systematically collected, and the people who could have told them are growing fewer every year. Chapter 14. The weight of what they made. The nostalgia for Triang is not sentimental. It is physical. Men now in their 70s and 80s remember these toys not as images or concepts, but as weight. The weight of a pressed steel pedal car under a Christmas tree, the heft of a Minnick tinplate lorry in a child's hand, the satisfying solidity of a Triang Hornby locomotive placed on its track. These were objects made from real materials by real people in a real factory, and they carried that reality in every gram. A Triang pedal car didn't pretend to be a car. It was, in some irreducible sense, an actual small car, stamped from steel, welded, painted, chromed, assembled with the same techniques and in the same building that had produced weapons of war. The plastic toys that replaced them were lighter, cheaper, brighter, more disposable. They were marketed on television to children who had never held a pressed steel toy and didn't know what they were missing. The Triang story is, compressed to its essentials, the story of British manufacturing itself. A working-class family rises through skill and enterprise. They build something extraordinary. They expand to a scale their founders could never have imagined. They fail to adapt to a world that has changed around them. And they are destroyed, not by a single catastrophe, but by 1,000 reasonable decisions, each one moving the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it. The factory is demolished. The workers scatter. The site becomes a trading estate. And all that remains is the memory of weight. Walter Lynes, the genius who designed the factory, the toys and the Sten gun, spent his retirement making handmade wooden toys in a workshop in Levant. He went back to where it all began, to the craft his father had practiced, to the wood his grandfather had worked in a narrow street off Saffron Hill. The empire of pressed steel had been his life's work. At the end, he chose the material he'd started with. He died aged 90, 13 months after the company fell. His factory was demolished 2 years after that. The pedal cars rusted in gardens. The model railways gathered dust in attics. The dolls lost their shoes. And the workers of Merton walked out of the gate for the last time into a South London afternoon to find something else to do with their lives. Nobody put up a plaque.